See a very, very rare item coming on now. This is the British light tank, a Mark IV it was called. We made 34 of these in 1934 and 1935, so you could argue this one here, the last one left, rarer than our Tiger tank inside the museum. Now what we wanted to talk about, or what we have talked about 2 previous days, so forgive me again if you were listening to this before, we've got an attitude, haven't we? If you're British and you like tanks, most of our stuff with a pile of poo in World War II. It's interesting to see why we built what we built, and some of the background information that explains perhaps a little bit more why our tanks were as they were in the Second World War. So we go back to 1930, Great Depression, in 20 years, and no factory keeps open that long just to wait for an order. So these light tanks, like this light Mark IV, they were really there to test, to make factories learn the art of building tanks for the first time. And that's why Britain, by the way, had 1,000 light Mark VI-B tanks in 1940. Not that the army really wanted them, but the orders had gone in to build up that capacity. They were the way to begin and learn how to build tanks again. Now, one of the other things in the early 1930s, 1934, now this particular Matilda I, that we're lucky we've got the last 3 remaining Matilda Is in the collection. One on display inside. This one was a range wreck. What you're listening to, by the way, in the back there is a Rover car engine. It was, when it was restored, it was all that was available at the time to get this as a runner. Radio is behind the driver, so the commander has to drop down inside the turret to operate the radio if once fitted. Not all of them. We hadn't even got enough radios when it first goes into service. As they build the Matilda I, they've already done drawings for a better tank. And that's going to be the next model of infantry tank. They knew, even the Matilda I, even as they're starting to build it, they know this is a compromise. This is something so we can get going. And this will take from those initial drawings to the production of the very first Matilda II is 3 years, and that is lightning speed for building a tank at this sort of time. By the way, we're going to look at some of the British tanks of today this afternoon. You look at their gestation period. Sometimes we're looking at things that take decades. So that Matilda II was a real success story. It's got a 2-pounder gun, better than any of the anti-tank guns that are out there in the late 1930s and 1940s. The Germans have the 37mm, the 2-pounder, slightly larger, much more penetration than the German 37mm. The armour on the Matilda II, 78mm thick. Again, we're going to see our Panzer III later on. When that goes into service, 5 centimetres of armour on the front there. So already this is thicker armour for that infantry role. So it's actually very successful. Now it's much better to have 2-pounders today than the promise of a better gun maybe in a month or 2 time if the factories have to stop and retool. So there we have light tank, first type of infantry tank, second type of infantry tank. We're going to look now at a different type of tank that Britain was going to build, a cruiser tank. No, we're not. I saw it moving over the back there. We're going to look at the 4th type of infantry tank, the Churchill tank coming on. So I've got the gun, saw the one over the far corner. So 1940, lessons learned from France. We're going to need a bigger gun. We said that. We're going to need more armour. And this becomes the Churchill tank that you're seeing now. The very first couple of models of Churchill, but we really think you guys ought to start having these tanks, because again, we're still looking at emergency measures here. And that's the story. Hold that one in your head till we see the British Army vehicles this afternoon. Because ironically, the Churchill had a disastrous introduction to service. Loads of breakdowns, lots of things going wrong. But when those were ironed out, it had a cracking career in the Second World War. And of course, the Churchill is the basis for lots of that specialised armour. You can see our Avery, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers Museum, with that Centaur water. Now this is a Mark III Churchill, so a very early one. The Mark I and II, they're trying to work out about armament, 2-pounder turret, or maybe powering this one along. Haven't got a running cruiser from earlier in the war period or the late war period, but again, Britain were thinking in the late 1930s, yeah, we might be fighting in Europe. That's where infantry tanks are going to be really useful if there's trench warfare again. Also, we might be fighting out against the Italians. Early 1930s, Italy was a bigger threat for Britain than actually Germany was. It's only from the later 30s that Germany emerges as a greater threat. So we build a series of cruiser tanks, some you're familiar with, the Crusader, out in the Western Desert, duck-filled engine in the back of it, relatively thin arm, this is the replacement program. We know of as the Comet that's been put together as a... We don't use those in combat as a gun tank. We only use the ones with the meteor engine in, the very similar looking vehicles, but that's the one that's called the Cromwell. That riveted turret I was talking about earlier, do a great work, rivet the armour plate. It's easier for tank riveting. Later versions with the Cromwell also have a welded turret. Now we're going to design a really great tank before the end of World War II to replace this as a cruiser. They're going to call it a heavy cruiser. We're going to see it after lunch. The interim tanks, this fellow coming around now, they get 40% of the Cromwell parts, improve on a design, and we make this tank the Comet. Different case for the propellant. They took the case from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. It makes that gun a little bit smaller in the turret so it can squeeze in. But that gun firing new types of ammo, discarding Sabo it's called, that pot that comes out the end of the barrel with a slug of tungsten in. When this is going into service in late 1944, that gun has better penetration than the Panzer tank's gun that you can see in the museum. Making sure we're not invaded, concentrating on the Navy and the Air Force, and then later in the war we go back to good designs like the Comet, and then of course the Centurion that follows it. And there's the tank you see, basically a Spitfire engine in the back, and they put it in. The first models, they tried to put a silencer on it, and then they just gave up. They said, no, you're going to hear this coming. So if you look at the back fishtail exhaust, forget about trying to make it quiet. That's going to be part of its fear factor coming towards you. So I will shut up for a moment, and you can just listen to those engines going around. Reset, and then we're going to be showing you some of the other contemporary vehicles around the Second World War time to put those vehicles in a bit of context as well.
Run the museum without the volunteers like yourself, and we're ever so grateful for what you do. It's time now though for you to put your other hat on. In fact, you're not wearing a hat anymore. This is our next display here in the main arena. It is a wonderful display. World War II, the tank comes of age. Tim Broad, thank you.
Thanks, Steve, thank you. We've already seen, ladies and gentlemen, how the tank was introduced into combat in the First World War. We've seen the development of some British tanks. We're going to start off this section by looking at a German tank. The one coming in now is the Panzer Mk III. This is the first medium tank built by the Germans. The Panzer I was basically a propaganda vehicle. It looked good on propaganda films, marching up down the Unter den Linden. Wasn't particularly a combat vehicle. Panzer II, a reconnaissance vehicle, very good at what it did, but very, very limited in combat. This is their first main gun tank, the Panzer Mk III. Designed in 1935, the intention was always to mount that when you start a weapon system being produced, it pretty much creates its own dynamic. You have to keep on with it, particularly if you're trying to equip an army, the Sturmgeschütz III assault gun. And in fact, the Stug 3 was the most successful killer of Allied tanks in World War II. So it's very tempting to look at the big King Tigers and what have you. It was a derivative of that vehicle there, which destroyed most Allied armour in World War II. Now in 1941, of course, something else happened. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the Americans came into the war. But even before that, the Americans had agreed, Roosevelt had agreed to supply armour to Britain, and this is the first American tank that was supplied to us, the first American-built tank to see combat in July of 1941. This is the M3A1 Stuart. Experience of producing tanks. This is an upgrade of the existing light tanks. It's worth saying it's called a Stuart because famously Winston Churchill found it difficult to cope with the alphanumeric designation that the Americans gave their vehicles. That's an M3A1. You're going to see another M3A1 come on in a moment, which is entirely different. Churchill said, look, for goodness sake, why don't they just give them names? So he tended to name American tanks after American generals. This is named after Jem Stuart. She was always known as the Honey. A British driver got out, by Alexander, got out of the tank, and reliable. Unlike most British tanks at the time, you got in it, you turned the key and it started. It was mechanically reliable, quick, across the battlefield. The problem was that 37mm gun, you can see the turret there, was already becoming obsolete, and it was quite thinly armoured. What the Americans really needed was to develop a medium tank. But that was going to be quite difficult, backed up by heavier medium tanks. So they did see service throughout World War II. The 7th Armoured Div use these, and it's these little tanks which Michael Vickman came up against at the famous Battle of Villers-Bocage, right? And it just puts that into context. He got a Tiger, the tanks he were engaging were more that size. Now, I'm very excited by this one. I've never seen one of these things moving before. This is an M3A1, it's an M3A1 Grant. This is the interim medium tank that the Germans put together. Remember, the problem is trying to squeeze a big gun into a turret. The Americans were struggling to get that right. So the turret on the top here is, and not an American operated Lee, because it's got that bustle there on the back of the turret that was put on the British specification to take the radio. So you've got that bustle back there, it's the heart and the hull. Really copied the French tank, the French Char 1. It's got limited traverse, but it can fire high explosive, and it can actually engage German anti-tank guns, fire high explosive. And the curse really of the British 2-pounder was it tended to sometimes called the tank that shocked Rommel. Rommel didn't like these because it allowed the British to engage his screens of anti-tank guns. He had this tendency to lay out a screen of anti-tank guns to entice the British towards it and then to knock them out before they came into range. This could engage the anti-tank guns. Now I'm going to hand over now to my colleague David, because he's got the big medium M4 Sherman.
So what we're looking at with this amazing shot up M3, so the design again of the Sherman, components used from the Grant and the Lee, you're looking at suspension systems that have been tried and tested. They've got the Bovingdon R975 engine, that's what they want. Actually, America, they can't make enough of the same engine, so they end up having 4 different engine types in Sherman tanks in World War II. And if you're really nerdy, that's the reason why. M4A1, that's a cast-style version, but M4A2, as we're looking at behind us. M4's basically radial engine, M4A2 has a twin diesel, etc., etc. So all these little modifications and marks firstly relates to the engine. If after that it then has brackets 76, that means 76mm gun. This one, the bigger gun that was put on later in the war, starts being seen in the field about December 1944. So again, the success of the Sherman and its predecessor. Now obviously many of you will recognise this particular Sherman that belongs to the Tank Museum. This M4A2 is done up to look like an American Sherman being used. Most of this model actually were given to the Soviet Union in World War II. The Soviet Union, it was given trucks, huge amounts of material. They became part of Lend-Lease, so American equipment going over on basically peppercorn rates, as it were, agreed by Roosevelt. The only issue was, of course, this was capitalist equipment, so all the photos tended to be edited out after the war. Very hard finding pictures of these Shermans. One was just like this, helped to liberate ours, we've left it in the paint scheme. And as you can see, we've got Brad Pitt again back up in the turret today. Our version here, again, after the war, a number of different countries, different tests, and the Sherman story, so you can follow it through World War II. Of course, it doesn't end there. There were so many made, 49,000 Sherman tanks made in the Second World War, so they went on to see service with many other armies, many other conflicts around the war in the Middle East, etc. And that's why we're lucky enough in many ways to have so many Shermans around today that can be restored or cooked. back in good order, so we can actually see them. Designed originally, of course, a bit like a British cruiser, for exploitation. To fight enemy tanks, the American commander McNair, who's in charge of ground forces, then purpose-built fast chassis with a powerful anti-tank gun on. They look like a tank to us, things like the M10, then later the Hellcat, anti-tank guns. Doesn't quite work in reality, and the Americans dropped the idea. Inevitably, you've not got the right equipment in the right place at the right time. Now, not a Sherman, but using M3 and M4 components from America, this is the Sexton, made in Canada in World War II. They start with the Ram tank, move on to something called the Grizzly, but America can make so many Shermans that's unnecessary. So they change the Grizzly production. We then have the Priest, the American M10 tank vehicle with its 110 gun. We then go to this, which is probably the best one of all, the British 25-pounder in it. And after the war, of course, we went on, we had the Abbott with the 105 gun. This particular variant of IPO brought to us this weekend, 25-pounder gun in. This was used by many armies after World War II, and this is an ex-Portuguese army vehicle that a number were brought into Britain when they went out of service in the 1980s. And we
Continuing with the display, you've already seen some of America's So with reconnaissance vehicles, what you really need is something that is stealthy, really quiet, and above all, quick. Get in, have a look, report back, and get out again. The motto of the reconnaissance corps was only the enemy in front, because they really were up the sharp. Now one wheeled vehicle, but it is swift. Now the thing that the crews really did like about this, and the M24 Chaffee, is designed mid-war. It makes its debut around about the time of the Battle of Bulge. So the autumn, winter of 1944-45. The thing that the crew really did like about the Chaffee is its reliability and far more gun. This actually has a lightweight 75mm gun, which is a very, very good piece of armament for a wrecking vehicle. The Chaffee served in the US Army, and also it is widely used by the Israeli Defense Force. And something that's sometimes quite unkindly referred to as tracking tanks. So, if you're a little basic maintenance themselves. There is one thing about it, the most prized possession of T-34 crew were the tarpaulin they guarded them like gold. Not one to do was to have to sleep in the tank. It is also capable of improvement. It started off as the T-34-76 with a two-man turret. But the most important thing about T-34, I think I've kept till last, numbers. And there are still quite a lot of T-34s even now in semi-frontline service in one part of the world or another. Thank you very much for watching and listening.